our part 2 of our Implementing Vision Zero using an equity lens. This morning, we have 3 presenters. For anybody who wasn't able to join us last time, we have Catherine Prince, Jay Aber, and myself, Jennifer Pangborn, that are going to be speaking today. There's a presentation. And here's what we're going to be going through. We'll do a quick overview of some of the things we talked about last time. Then we're going to jump into some case studies of talking about integrating equity into Vision Zero, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We want to be really clear on what we are referring to when we say equity. We're not talking about equality where everything is evenly distributed. We're talking about equity, where people get the tools that they need. And if you look at this picture that we showed last time, you notice that there are different size ladders to reach the apples at the tree here. That's equity. People get what they need. We also want to recognize that we are all learning and that this is a safe space. So we're really hoping that all questions can, that we're being open and honest in any dialogue afterwards. And we shared this last time, and I wanted to reiterate this to start out today. Our team has started to look at our transportation systems and our projects as equidimes. And an equidime is a paradigm shift with equity at the focus. And in our industry, we're defining this as the pattern of planning, policy, and design with equity impacts at the forefront that our industry is working to address. Really, in short, this is a shift of focusing on people and where safety is needed to really improve mobility. And to build equity into Vision Zero, for our work to be equitable for communities and people, we need to focus on where people live and how they are being negatively impacted by safety. And that is people and land use. We also need to ask questions to the people who are impacted by projects to ensure that their voices are brought forth. And that's people and engagement. And we can mitigate safety issues by focusing on design and safety improvements where they can save lives. And that's people and engineering. And we also need to focus on educating people and aligning policies to ensure that safety is for all users. And that's people and education. And lastly, we need to use the data that we are going to talk a lot about today, and we did in part 1, to support transportation investments. And that's people and evaluation. And all of these E's and land use combined leads us to empowering projects and people in order for us to move towards Vision Zero. So that's what we're going to talk through today, the E's and land use. And our first example, where I'll just discuss land use briefly, is looking at a case study in Miami. So last time we discussed in more detail redlining and the practice of identifying on maps, historically on maps, where people of color and immigrant populations were able to live and forced to live in cities. These were physical lines drawn on maps and colored in red as shown in the 3 maps here. And multiple cities across the United States undertook roadway and interstate and large infrastructure projects back in the 1950s and 1960s and built them through these redlined areas because these were the areas that were deemed undesirable and divided numerous communities. And one of the examples is in Miami, where the city designated a portion of the city industrial and redlined, and a predominantly person of color area called Overton. And similar to many redlined people of color neighborhoods and cities, Overtown, was the center of Black culture and established households living in this community that was, next slide, that was really, it was It was dismantled and broken in the middle of the last century as the interstate system came in. I-95 came in and used this deemed area, this redlined zoned area, as placement for the interstate system and displaced a number of the population and the economy that was built there. However, now many cities similar to this Miami project are working to address this inequity of the past by redesigning and rebuilding these transportation systems in a safe way that connect the surrounding communities, incorporate all modes, whether people are walking, biking, or driving, thinking through how the people are impacted and how they work in these areas. They're adding green space and incorporating the voices of the people and the communities. And in some cases, like this Miami underdeck, are incorporating community amenities back into the project. And this Miami underdeck is a great example of working towards changing the narrative of how land use has impacted safety and communities.
I'll be talking about funding prioritization for Vision Zero projects in Miami-Dade County, some key indicators for safety projects evaluation, and enforcement strategies. As we discussed in part one, WSP assisted Miami-Dade County with understanding the current state of roadway safety, then developing Vision Zero strategies. So the first step, we collected road crash data and plotted the locations where crashes resulted in severe or fatal injuries based on user mode. That would be both people driving and crashes involving people walking and biking. So logically, the next step would have been for us to identify the high crash area and identify safety projects. We did not take that path because we saw some clusters. Some parts of the county has clusters of safety issues. So we wanted to investigate that further and understand what the underlying causes may be. We discussed last at the part one webinar that there are some location-based inequity or vulnerable areas. So we went through a process and vetted a number of socioeconomic factors, trying to understand the correlation between the highest crash areas and the socioeconomic factors within a census tract. And the conclusion we came to was the areas with the highest crash rate are the areas which also happen to have the lowest income households with zero cars, and who happen to be predominantly African American or Hispanic communities. The number of impacted roadways are pretty overwhelming and sobering. So as the next step, if we have to prioritize safety projects, who and where should we invest our finite funding? This map is the high injury network that we identified, which is the high crash intersections and segments. And the map shown here also shows this layer of high vulnerability area, which in the previous slide we discussed as the vulnerable locations. It just provides a context to the high injury locations. As you can see, majority of the locations are within the vulnerable communities. We also looked at user mode inequity, the vulnerable users. So this type of vulnerability impacts people no matter where you travel, even outside the locations we described as inequitable and vulnerable areas. The vulnerable users are simply those who are traveling outside a vehicle, whether they choose to walk, bike, or use micromobility, and most of us are familiar with this. The other vulnerable users who are not commonly discussed are people who are trying to access transit, and vehicle mobility is not a choice because of mobility or financial challenges. These are older adults, people who are young, people with disabilities, people living in poverty. The last one are minorities. The vulnerable users as minorities are commonly not discussed. But in the first webinar, we talked about African American children are likely twice as likely to be killed than Latino children, and Latino children are 40% more likely to be killed in a traffic-related incident than white children. Now, these are true through the entire country, and there are several research papers studying as to why this is happening. And some of them are listed here in the sources. One of the reasons identified was a racial bias in driving behavior, driver yielding behavior at crosswalks. So our biases impact safety. Next step, how do we invest in safety projects? We found that there were over 3,000 high injury locations. So how do we prioritize? As transportation professionals, how do we tackle this? So we developed a methodology similar to what emergency services use after a disaster. They use a system called triage to prioritize treatment. And the methodology simply is the medical personnel reviews a person's severity and that person's likelihood of recovery without treatment. So the second criteria speaks to the underlying correlations or the internal injuries that may change the person's survival rate, even if it's not superficially visible. So using that idea, for Miami-Dade County, we used this methodology, which is project prioritization using not just the location's severe and frequency of crashes, but also combining it with the underlying correlations. Because without that, the outcomes of the safety outcomes will not change without targeted intervention. So here's the methodology. We combined the intersections and segments. So there were about 3,000 intersections, 1,500 segments. We combined it to make 1,500 projects. And the methodology we used was scores were given to projects locations, frequency, and severity of crashes with a 55% rating, which is a majority. And the second part, we looked at the likelihood of outcomes changing without targeted intervention. And for this, the criteria we used was the equity score. So the locations that we have found to be vulnerable have a 25% weighting, and locations which are close to transit, current and future transit, was given 20% of the weighting. And this is what the list of projects look like, the top 50 projects in the county. And as you can see, a majority of them are within the areas we identified as vulnerable areas. So after we identify projects, when we implement the countermeasures, be it policy or engineering countermeasures, we should evaluate if these improvements made a difference in the safety outcomes through before and after studies. And the criteria for evaluation must be both qualitative and quantitative. The supporting qualitative information are from the users' survey responses. And while a survey response might be not black and white as data, it is important to study nevertheless, so we have a 360 view of what's happening there. And the criteria itself is, yes, let's look at safety outcomes. Let's also look at how we have invested in safer infrastructure for the vulnerable users and the safety outcomes resulting from the investment. The qualitative and the quantitative metrics are noted in the bullets below. Lastly, should we consider traffic citations during project evaluation? And we are suggesting that we should not. And here is why. Number one, enforcement and traffic safety have shown no correlation in any studies, both nationally and internationally. In fact, social scientists and public health scholars now widely acknowledge that police contact is a key vector of health inequity and an important cause of early mortality for people of color. So unequal policing in communities of color have resulted in inequitable outcomes. Also consider that in the US, We have built a number of roadways for vehicle capacity and speed, leaving out the needs of non-motor users. So it's not shocking that vehicle speeds are high when the roads are empty. We saw that during the quarantine last year. And it should not be shocking that people cross mid-block when there's a destination that the road designers did not account for, or the closest roadway crossing is 800 feet away. So consider if better infrastructure design and targeted local policies would encourage safer behavior rather than enforcement. So how can we incorporate PD within our Vision Zero framework? We are looking at a shift in paradigm from enforcement to empowerment and partnerships. On the right side is a slide of on the slide is a pamphlet for newly installing improvement. We work with PD to develop and distribute these informational pamphlets to engage and educate the users and on how their behavior impacts everybody's safety. The other part is we should consider using automated speed enforcement to remove the human bias. And Washington, DC has a successful program and readily available on their webpage. And they found success, particularly within communities of color. And with that, I pass it on to Jay.
So I'm going to talk about more on the engineering, implementation, and design section, a case study in Kansas City. This is the Linwood Boulevard corridor that we discussed in part one, and these are two segments from that corridor project, the western segment in a more affluent, more white neighborhood, the eastern segment highlighted here in the high minority, high poverty, and low car ownership neighborhood. On the left shows 39th Street, that western segment. It's a kind of a traditional downtown development with zero lot line buildings, narrow lanes, parking, and lots of pedestrian and bicycle activity. On the right shows Linwood Boulevard, much wider, more generous for cars, wide lanes, wide roadway, and you can see this segment is actually adjacent to the high school and middle school on the right, and on the left is the district sports complex. If we look at these two corridors from a traditional engineering analysis perspective, we can see that 39th Street has much higher crashes, number of crashes and rate of crashes than Linwood Boulevard. This might indicate in the traditional perspective that 39th Street should be a focus of our study. But if we actually shift our mindset into a Vision Zero mindset, and instead of looking at all crashes, we look at serious injury and fatal crashes and vulnerable user crashes, the bicycle and pedestrian crashes, you can see that 39th Street had no serious injury or fatal crashes, no bicycle and pedestrian crashes, whereas Linwood Boulevard had a very high number. And this is over a 10-year period. So having, in a very short segment, almost one fatal or serious injury crash per year on this segment was very high. So using a Vision Zero analysis highlights safety issues in communities of concern that a traditional analysis does not. And this is not just a one-off example that happened to match the data. If you look at the overall mapping, this map here is on the right is what we showed in the first, where you can see the fatal crash rates are much higher in the historically segregated red line community. But the map on the left shows the rate of all crashes, and there's no correlation to those neighborhoods, and it's much more evenly distributed. So if you don't use a Vision Zero mindset in your safety analyses, you won't necessarily understand the equity implications and the correlation with equity in disinvested communities. A second important part, in addition to using the correct data analysis, is engagement. If we're going to provide the proper facilities for a corridor that's going to work best for the local residents, we need to engage them to understand their issues, understand their needs, and understand their desires before we select countermeasures. And engaging the communities where they are to make sure we're engaging the actual people who will be on it is important, and understanding their specific needs in their specific neighborhood can help identify those countermeasures. This is what we did on this corridor study, and on 39th Street, because of using the data, you can see on the next slide that we had very minimal recommendations on 39th Street, some minor traffic calming, whereas on Linwood Boulevard, we put a lot more effort into prioritizing projects there that would really be a huge safety benefit for all users, provide mobility for walking, biking, transit, and safety for driving and all modes. When selecting actual countermeasures, they're not much different from what you would do with any other traditional project. Once the prioritization is done, once the engagement's done, once the education's done that Catherine and Jennifer talked about, we're selecting countermeasures based on data-driven and experience-based solutions. We're using the best practices, and there are a lot of best practices out there from the Highway Safety Manual, from the NACTO guidance like the Urban Street Design Guide, the Global Street Design Guide. There's a wealth of knowledge out there for these experience-based and data-driven solutions. And as long as they're applied in places that have the most need through prioritization, then we can really help start to address the equity issues through countermeasures.
All the strategies that we just discussed are aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The key takeaways from this webinar is building equity into all projects, including Vision Zero implementation. Number one thing to do is put people in the center of all the strategies. Just using data in isolation is not going to get us the results we desire. And ensuring that there's racial sensitivity when developing these strategies. And as Jay mentioned, engaging the people, the community will give us the answers we need. And at the end, shifting towards a safety and mobility equidime by challenging the conventional seen processes. So we're going to leave you with a safety and mobility equidime challenge on the 3 A's. One, acknowledge. Do we know who are disproportionately impacted within our communities around you? If not, let's go and find that information. Once we have that information, let's absorb it. Let's look at what can be done to shift the safety trajectory for the disproportionately impacted people, as well as for the entire community. And finally, action and achieve. What can you do in your community to further the mobility and safety equidime using all the strategies we just discussed today? With that, we go into questions.
Thank you, Tim. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. Keep in mind that today's presentation, you will get the recording as well by email. And also if you missed part 1, you will get it as well. I will start with the first question. Please explain how land use is connected to Vision Zero. I've heard the ease of Vision Zero, but never land use.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, land use really determines historically where people have lived in some of our communities, and understanding where people live, how they're trying to move from their homes to different places, you know, really impacts where some of our safety concerns, safety issues, crashes have occurred in our cities. And so we really have to be thinking about, you know, the land use and the history and get that knowledge when we are looking at safety issues. Jay?
Yeah, land use has a huge impact on Vision Zero. It's not something that is discussed as often, but the different modes of transportation have drastically different risk profiles, and transit especially has a much safer record than driving a passenger vehicle. And so if we can form our land use decisions based on how we can make it possible to use transit and feasible and easy, and how to walk and bike more, we can really impact Vision Zero outside of the engineering countermeasures, but in a more enduring and systemic way.
Fantastic, thank you. Next question. Have you carried out risk profile study along the design alignment of, say, highway project, and how design for safety is embedded in the design process of infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I can take that. And I think that's similar to what we did on the Linwood Boulevard corridor study, is looking at the length of the corridor with a Vision Zero mindset, looking at the relative risks, looking at the rates, and then combining that with the equity data and the transportation data, such as where are people using more transit, where are people walking and biking more, so we can identify those risks and target countermeasures appropriately. And I think this is something that should be done on all engineering design projects and planning projects, corridor planning projects, where we do a neighborhood by neighborhood assessment of where are the risks and where should the money be prioritized for investment to really mitigate those risks.
Thank you. Next question. Have you carried out community awareness program to reduce accidents by involving transportation agencies?
Maybe I can go in first. Transportation agencies can be state or local or county-wide. The case studies we presented today, I had shown a county-wide study that was done. It was led by the Department of Public Works and Transportation. So yes, we have engaged with a number of these safety projects to prioritize funding, right? First, we have to look at the data as to where it's happening, then prioritize projects, and then work with the community and the state, local agencies to then deliver these projects on the ground.
Thank you.
Jay, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, from the engineering perspective, we don't do as much as the educational, aside from through our actual engagement and educating the community in what we're attempting to achieve, how we are attempting to improve their community, their outcomes in their community, and a lot of focus in the past in the United States has been on education of drivers, of users, of pedestrians and cyclists. But in some ways, the focus on education has taken the focus off of engineering and land use issues and other issues. So I think the education piece is important, especially to help people understand what the priorities are, where the issues are. But engineering and the other E's in there are just as important, if not more important than education. Because if we have safe roadways to begin with, you don't need as much education for the users to use them safely if they're inherently safe.
If I can add to that, so when we talk about education, it's not only educating the community and the users as to how to use the infrastructure, it's also educating and our transportation professionals. So we talked about an equity, Equidime, which is a paradigm shift. So also empowering our transportation professionals with information that they need to do things differently and consider the other factors which we have not taken into account while designing roadways. For example, we design roadways in isolation. We do not look at the land use, and the key, as Jennifer mentioned, is to integrate the land use, the people, and the streets adjacent to that land use.
Thank you. We'll take the last question. How do you incorporate equity in projects that may not be a Vision Zero project?
I can start on that. And I think for me, every project is a Vision Zero project. Every transportation project is a Vision Zero project. If every transportation project is not a Vision Zero project, we'll never achieve Vision Zero truly. So every transportation project, whether it's a planning project, an engineering project, or even on the planning side, the land use side, we need to incorporate Vision Zero thinking into that. And also we need to incorporate equity into every project. Again, the same with Vision Zero. If we're not considering equity with all of our decisions, we won't be able to move towards a more equitable future. So projects that aren't specifically Vision Zero projects can take the same approach, can do the same things when looking at equity, when looking at safety, the fatal and serious injury crashes on the corridor, doing everything we can, no matter what the project type is, to move forward to change that safety and mobility Equidime.
Thank you. Apologies for not reading all today's questions. Thank you for entering those. Those will be answered directly by the presenters. So it looks like we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with the team via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Catherine, Jennifer, and Jay for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I will wrap up the webinar now. Thank you very much, everyone.